To understand what exactly caused the war in Ukraine, we have to rewind back a couple of years. The infamous Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviets began to secretly install nuclear weapons in Cuba, which was a direct response to the US installing Jupiter missiles in Turkey. And after days of tensions in a nuclear standoff, a deal was reached for each party to remove its weapons, with the US promised not to invade Cuba. This event is what largely gave the birth to the concept of mutual assured destruction. But in 1990, however, and in order to convince the Soviets on German reunification, the US allegedly promised the Soviets that NATO will not expend 1 inch towards the east from Germany. The key word here is of course allegedly, because the US officially denies this. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in 1999, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland joined NATO. Then 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined NATO. And then in 2008, President Bush, after his mission accomplished in Iraq, probably just got bored and invited Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. Of course, both countries are on Russia's border. During that same year, Russia invaded Georgia and Ukraine was warned. The following year, Albania and Croatia joined NATO. NATO, led by the US, has been building a network of anti-ballistic missile systems across Europe. The purpose of this network, as stated by the US and allies, is to protect Europe against Iranian and North Korean ballistic missiles. Russia, however, says the system is aimed to neutralize much of their offensive capabilities and therefore mess with the balance of power and the concept of mutual assured destruction. In the second half of 2013, Ukraine was in deep economic crisis. Both Europe and Russia presented solutions, but the Ukrainian president at the time, Yanukovych, went with the Russians. This triggered Western opposition to rally protests in Kiev, and by 2014, a new pro-Western government was installed in Ukraine. Russia called it a coup, and evidence of the US involvement began to hit the surface, like the leaked call between US Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and US Ambassador to Ukraine discussing who they should put in power. As a response, Russia took Crimea after a referendum was held in the region that's 82% ethnically Russian. The West, of course, didn't recognize the referendum. The majority ethnic Russians in the Donbass also didn't like that Kiev is pro-West now. The two self-proclaimed republics claimed independence and a war broke. The following year, Germany, France, and Russia convinced the two parties to sign the Minsk agreement, under which Ukraine is to offer full autonomy to the Donbass, but the agreement failed. 2016 is here, Trump's won office, and things stayed largely the same, with continued shelling between Ukrainian forces and forces of the Donbass backed by Russia. But then in 2020, Biden wins office and tensions start to rise again. Talks of Ukraine joining NATO and massive honor transfer and training to Ukraine by the US. 2 years later, Russia started massing troops on the border with Ukraine and issued demands to the West and allies, most notable of which was Ukraine neutrality. The West refuted those demands and stated Ukraine should be free to join NATO. And on February 24th of last year, Russia invaded Ukraine. The following day, President Zelensky declared his country is ready to discuss neutrality. Peace negotiations started in Turkey, and a draft was reached between the two parties. Russia withdrew its troops from Kiev, allegedly to create conditions for peace, and signed the final agreement. On Sunday, April 10th, however, Boris Johnson made a surprise visit to Kiev and pressured Zelensky to abandon peace talks, arguing that Ukraine should not pursue what he called bad peace. So how did we get here? The issue of NATO expansion aside, what exactly triggered an uncontrolled war where red lines are being crossed every now and then? Well, the answer to that question is miscalculations. You see, both Russia and the West had their calculations before this war that no one was actually prepared for. The Russians wanted to push Ukraine and the West to the negotiating table. They invaded with 200,000 troops only, and for a country the size of Ukraine, that's just not enough. Hitting critical infrastructure was avoided at first, and they made it very clear via statements they were ready to negotiate at any time. That is, in the beginning, of course. The US and EU, on the other hand, prepared the biggest list of economic sanctions in recorded history, 11,000 by the US alone. The West thought these sanctions would cripple the Russian economy and cause utter chaos from the inside. Of course, as we know by now, the negotiations failed or sabotaged depending on your perspective, and sanctions not only failed but also backfired, driving some Western economies into recession. This confrontation between the West in Russia and Ukraine is part of a larger conflict between the leaders of the current order and those who wish to challenge it. This is what is known as the Thucydides trap, which is the subject of our next video. Until then, thanks for watching and see you around. Cheers!